Section 7 of Manners, Customs, and Dress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Donna Stewart. Manners, Customs, and Dress during the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance period, by Paul Lacroix, Section 7. Many centuries elapsed before the dawn of liberty could penetrate the social strata of this multitude, thus oppressed and denuded of all power of action. The development was slow, painful, and dearly bought, but at last it took place. First of all, towns sprang up, and with them, or rather by their influence, the inhabitants became possessed of social life. The agricultural population took its social position many generations later. As we have already seen, the great movement for the creation of communes and bourgeoisies only dates from the unsettled period ranging from the 11th to the 13th centuries, and simultaneously we see the bourgeois appear, already rich and luxurious, parading on all occasions their personal opulence. Their private life could only be an imitation of that in the châteaux. By degrees, as wealth strengthened and improved their condition and rendered them independent, we find them trying to procure luxuries equal or analogous to those enjoyed by the upper classes, and which appeared to them the height of material happiness. In all times the small have imitated the great. It was in vain that the great obstinately threatened, by the exercise of their prerogatives, to try and crush this tendency to equality which alarmed them, by issuing pecuniary edicts, summary laws, coercive regulations, and penal ordinances. By the force of circumstances, the arbitrary restrictions which the nobility laid upon the lower classes gradually disappeared, and the power of wealth displayed itself in spite of all their efforts to suppress it. In fact, occasions were not wanting in which the bourgeois class was able to refute the charge of unworthiness with which the nobles sought to stamp it. When taking a place in the council of the king, or employed in the administration of the provinces, many of its members distinguished themselves by firmness and wisdom. When called upon to assist in the national defence, they gave their blood and their gold with noble self-denial. And lastly, they did not fail to prove themselves possessed of those high and delicate sentiments of which the nobility alone claimed the hereditary possession. The bourgeois, says Arnaud de Marveil, one of the most famous troubadours of the 13th century, have divers sorts of merits. Some distinguish themselves by deeds of honour, others are by nature noble and behave accordingly. There are others thoroughly brave, courteous, frank, and jovial, who, although poor, find means to please by graceful speech, frequenting courts, and making themselves agreeable there. These, well versed in courtesy and politeness, appear in noble attire, and figure conspicuously at the tournaments and military games, proving themselves good judges and good company. Down to the 13th century, however rich their fathers or husbands might be, the women of the bourgeoisie were not permitted, without incurring a fine, to use the ornaments and stuffs exclusively reserved for the nobility. During the reigns of Philip Augustus and Louis IX., although these arbitrary laws were not positively abolished, a heavy blow was inflicted on them by the marks of confidence, esteem, and honour which these monarchs found pleasure in bestowing on the bourgeoisie. We find the first of these kings, when on the point of starting for a crusade, choosing 6 from amongst the principal members of the Parloir aux Bourgeois. It was thus that the first Hôtel de Ville, situated in the corner of the Place de la Grève, was named, to be attached to the Council of Regency, to whom he especially confided his will and the royal treasure. His grandson made a point of following his grandsire's example, and Louis IX. Showed the same appreciation for the new element which the Parisian bourgeoisie was about to establish in political life, by making the bourgeois Étienne Boileau one of his principal ministers of police, and the bourgeois Jean Sarrazin his chamberlain. Under these circumstances, the whole bourgeoisie gloried in the marks of distinction conferred upon their representatives, and during the following reign the ladies of this class, proud of their immense fortunes, but above all proud of the municipal powers held by their families, bedecked themselves, regardless of expense, with costly furs and rich stuffs, notwithstanding that they were forbidden by law to do so. Then came an outcry on the part of the nobles, and we read as follows in an edict of Philip le Bel, who inclined less to the bourgeoisie than to the nobles, and who did not spare the former in matters of taxation. No bourgeois shall have a chariot, nor wear gold, precious stones, or crowns of gold or silver. Bourgeois, not being either prelates or dignitaries of state, shall not have tapers of wax. A bourgeois possessing 2,000 pounds tournois or more may order for himself a dress of 12 sous 6 deniers, and one for his wife worth 16 sous at the most. The sou, which was but nominal money, may be reckoned as representing 20 francs, and the denier 1 franc, but allowance must be made for the enormous difference in the value of silver, which would make 20 francs in the 13th century represent upwards of 200 francs of our present currency. But these regulations as to the mode of living were so little or so carelessly observed, that all the successors of Philip le Bel thought it necessary to re-enact them, and indeed Charles VII, 1 century later, was obliged to censure the excess of luxury in dress by an edict which was, however, no better enforced than the rest. It has been shown to the said lord, the King, Charles VII, that of all nations of the habitable globe there are none so changeable, outrageous, and excessive in their manner of dress as the French nation, and there is no possibility of discovering by their dress the state or calling of persons, be they princes, nobles, bourgeois, or working men, because all are allowed to dress as they think proper, whether in gold or silver, silk or wool, without any regard to their calling. At the end of the 13th century, a rich merchant of Valenciennes went to the court of the King of France wearing a cloak of furs covered with gold and pearls. Seeing that no one offered him a cushion, he proudly sat on his cloak. On leaving, he did not attempt to take up the cloak, and on a servant calling his attention to the fact, he remarked, "It is not the custom in my country for people to carry away their cushions with them." Respecting a journey made by Philip le Bel and his wife Jeanne de Navarre to the towns of Bruges and Ghent, the historian Jean Meyer relates that Jeanne, on seeing the costly array of the bourgeois of those two rich cities, exclaimed, "I thought I was the only queen here, but I see more than 600." In spite of the laws, the Parisian bourgeoisie soon rivalled the Flemish in the brilliancy of their dress. Thus, in the second half of the 14th century, the famous Christine de Pisan relates that, having gone to visit the wife of a merchant during her confinement, it was not without some amazement that she saw the sumptuous furniture of the apartment in which this woman lay in bed. The walls were hung with precious tapestry of Cyprus, on which the initials and motto of the lady were embroidered. The sheets were of fine linen of Rheims, and had cost more than 300 pounds. The quilt was a new invention of silk and silver tissue. The carpet was like gold. The lady wore an elegant dress of crimson silk, and rested her head and arms on pillows ornamented with buttons of oriental pearls. It should be remarked that this lady was not the wife of a large merchant, such as those of Venice and Genoa, but of a simple retail dealer, who was not above selling articles for 4 sous. Such being the case, we need not be surprised that Christine should have considered the anecdote worthy of being immortalized in a book. It must not, however, be assumed that the sole aim of the bourgeoisie was that of making a haughty and pompous display. This is refuted by the testimony of the Ménagier de Paris, a curious anonymous work, the author of which must have been an educated and enlightened bourgeois. The Ménagier, which was first published by the Baron Jérôme Pichon, is a collection of counsels addressed by a husband to his young wife as to her conduct in society, in the world, and in the management of her household. The first part is devoted to developing the mind of the young housewife, and the second relates to the arrangements necessary for the welfare of her house. It must be remembered that the comparatively trifling duties relating to the comforts of private life which devolved on the wife were not so numerous in those days as they are now, but on the other hand they required an amount of practical knowledge on the part of the housewife which she can nowadays dispense with. Under this head the Ménagier is full of information. After having spoken of the prayers which a Christian woman should say morning and evening, the author discusses the great question of dress, which has ever been of supreme importance in the eyes of the female sex. "Know, dear sister," the friendly name he gives his young wife, "that in the choice of your apparel you must always consider the rank of your parents and mine, and also the state of my fortune. Be respectably dressed, without devoting too much study to it, without too much plunging into new fashions. Before leaving your room, see that the collar of your gown be well adjusted, and is not put on crooked." Then he dilates on the characters of women, which are too often wilful and unmanageable. On this point, for he is not less profuse in examples than the Chevalier de la Tour Landry, he relates an amusing anecdote worthy of being repeated and remembered. I have heard the bailiff of Tournay relate that he found himself several times at table with men long married, and that he had wagered with them the price of a dinner under the following conditions. The company was to visit the abode of each of the husbands successively, and any one who had a wife obedient enough immediately, without contradicting or making any remark, to consent to count up to 4, should win the bet. But, on the other hand, those whose wives showed temper, laughed, or refused to obey, would lose. Under these conditions the company gaily adjourned to the abode of Robin, whose wife, called Marie, had a high opinion of herself. The husband said before all, "Marie, repeat after me what I shall say." "Willingly, sire." "Marie, say 1, 2, 3." But by this time Marie was out of patience, and said, "And 7, and 12, and 14. Why are you making a fool of me?" So that husband lost his wager. The company next went to the house of Maître Jean, whose wife Agnes Ska well knew how to play the lady. Jean said, "Repeat after me, 1." "And 2," answered Agnes Ska disdainfully, so he lost his wager. Tassin then tried, and said to Dame Tassin, "Count 1." "Go upstairs," she answered, "if you want to teach counting. I'm not a child." Another said, "Go away with you, you must have lost your senses," or similar words, which made the husbands lose their wagers. Those, on the contrary, who had well-behaved wives, gained their wager, and went away joyful. This amusing quotation suffices to show that the author of the Ménagier de Paris wished to adopt a jocose style, with a view to enliven the seriousness of the subject he was advocating. The part of his work in which he discusses the administration of the house is not less worthy of attention. One of the most curious chapters of the work is that in which he points out the manner in which the young bourgeoise is to behave towards persons in her service. Rich people in those days, in whatever station of life, were obliged to keep a numerous retinue of servants. It is curious to find that so far back as the period to which we allude, there was in Paris a kind of servants' registry office, where situations were found for servant maids from the country. The bourgeois gave up the entire management of the servants to his wife, but, on account of her extreme youth, the author of the work in question recommends his wife only to engage servants who shall have been chosen by Dame Agnes, the nun whom he had placed with her as a kind of governess or companion. "Before engaging them," he says, Know whence they come, in what houses they have been, if they have acquaintances in town, and if they are steady. Discover what they are capable of doing, and ascertain that they are not greedy nor inclined to drink. If they come from another country, try to find out why they left it, for generally it is not without some serious reason that a woman decides upon a change of abode. When you have engaged a maid, do not permit her to take the slightest liberty with you, nor allow her to speak disrespectfully to you. If, on the contrary, she be quiet in her demeanour, honest, modest, and shows herself amenable to reproof, treat her as if she were your daughter. Superintend the work to be done, and choose among your servants those qualified for each special department. If you order a thing to be done immediately, do not be satisfied with the following answers: "It shall be done presently," or "tomorrow early." Otherwise, be sure you will have to repeat your orders. To these severe instructions upon the management of servants, the bourgeois adds a few words respecting their morality. He recommends that they not be permitted to use coarse or indecent language, or to insult one another. Although he is of the opinion that necessary time should be given to servants at their meals, he does not approve of their remaining drinking and taking too long at table, concerning which practice he quotes a proverb in use at the time: "Quand valet prêche à table et cheval paie en guet, il est temps qu'on l'on oste, et c'est y est," which means that when a servant talks at table, and a horse feeds near a watering place, it is time he should be removed. He has been there long enough. The manner in which the author concludes his instruction proves his kindness of heart, as well as his benevolence. If one of your servants falls sick, it is your duty, setting everything else aside, to see to his being cured. It was thus that a bourgeois of the 15th century expressed himself, and as it is clear that he could only have been inspired to dictate his theoretical teachings by the practical experience which he must have gained for the most part among the middle class to which he belonged, we must conclude that in those days the bourgeoisie possessed considerable knowledge of moral dignity and social propriety. It must be added that by the side of the merchant and working bourgeoisie, who above all owed their greatness to the high functions of the municipality, the parliamentary bourgeoisie had raised itself to power, and that from the 14th century it played a considerable part in the state, holding at several royal courts at different periods, and at last almost hereditarily the highest magisterial positions. The very character of these great offices of president, or of parliamentary council, barristers, etc., proves that the holders must have had no small amount of intellectual culture. In this way a refined taste was created among this class, which the protection of kings, princes, and lords had alone hitherto encouraged. We find, for example, the Grosliers at Lyons, the Desthous and Séguiers in Paris, regardless of their bourgeois origin, becoming judicious and zealous patrons of poets, scholars, and artists. A description of Paris, published in the middle of the 15th century, describes amongst the most splendid residences of the capital the hotels of Juvénal des Ursins, of Bureau de Dampmartin, of Guillaume Seguin, of Mademoiselle Baillet, of Martin Double, and particularly that of Jacques Douchier, situated in the Rue des Prouvaires, in which were collected at great cost collections of all kinds of arms, musical instruments, rare birds, tapestry, and works of art. In each church in Paris, and there were upwards of 100, the principal chapels were founded by celebrated families of the ancient bourgeoisie, who had left money for one or more masses to be said daily for the repose of the souls of their deceased members. In the burial grounds, and principally in that of the Innocents, the monuments of these families of Parisian bourgeoisie were of the most expensive character, and were inscribed with epitaphs in which the living vainly tried to immortalize the deeds of the deceased. Every one has heard of the celebrated tomb of Nicolas Flamel and Pernelle his wife, the cross of Bureau, the epitaph of Yolande Bailly, who died in 1514 at the age of 88, and who saw, or might have seen, 295 children descended from her. In fact, The religious institutions of Paris afford much curious and interesting information relative to the history of the bourgeoisie. For instance, Jean Alais, who levied a tax of 1 denier on each basket of fish brought to market, and thereby amassed an enormous fortune, left the whole of it at his death for the purpose of erecting a chapel called St. Agnes, which soon after became the church of St. Eustace. He further directed that, by way of expiation, his body should be thrown into the sewer which drained the offal from the market, and covered with a large stone. This sewer, up to the end of the last century, was still called Pont Alais. Very often, when citizens made gifts during their lifetime to churches or parishes, the donors reserved to themselves certain privileges which were calculated to cause the motives which had actuated them to be open to criticism. Thus, in 1304, the daughters of Nicolas Araud, formerly provost of the merchants, presented to the church of Saint-Jacques-la-Boucherie the house and grounds which they inhabited, but one of them reserved the right of having a key of the church that she might go in whenever she pleased. Guillaume Hauchequel, in 1405, bought a similar right for the sum of 18 sols parisis per annum, equal to 25 francs, and Alain and his wife, whose house was close to 2 chapels of the church, undertook not to build so as in any way to shut out the light from one of the chapels, on condition that they might open a small window into the chapel, and so be enabled to hear the service without leaving their room. We thus see that the bourgeoisie, especially of Paris, gradually took a more prominent position in history, and became so grasping after power that it ventured, at a period which does not concern us here, to aspire to every sort of distinction, and to secure an important social standing. What had been the exception during the 16th century became the rule 2 centuries later. End of Section 7. Recording by Donna Stewart, Seattle, Washington.